Hey everyone, how's it going? Hope you're all doing great, as I always say, following the 3 H's of the channel and all that great stuff. And in this video, it's all about Montana and all the crazy things that happen there. So, if that sounds like something you're interested in, definitely pull up a stump with me, and let's jump into it. Thank you for watching. When I was 20, I went visiting my grandmother in Great Falls, Montana for Christmas. Grandma was loaded, very rich. Her house is huge and sits across the street from a really nice golf course in this super rich part of town. So, after we finished dinner, my brother went to hang out in his room that he has there. My grandma went to bed early because, well, she's older. I was sitting in the living room by the fireplace. I was playing Pokemon Omega Ruby, and then I get up to get a drink. I look out the front windows to the golf course. I see a deer just eating some grass by some trees. This is pretty cool. Deer are not that common in this area compared to the rest of the state, or even the country for that matter. So I opened the door to go outside and take a look at it. When the door opens, its head snaps up and looks directly at me. And then, the strangest thing happens. It stands up on its hind legs and walks like a person into the nearby trees, taking huge strides as if it was on stilts. I wasn't even scared, just absolutely baffled. I slowly walk back inside the house, close the curtains, and go into my room. I decide to play video games for the rest of the night. I was kinda spooked by that golf course after that. So this is not as scary or as weird as some other stuff that you might see or hear, but it happened back in the 2010s when I went to Montana with my dad. I think I was about 8 or maybe a little older. Anyways, this is some crazy stuff that happened to me. So we were in the middle of the Rocky Mountains, in Montana to be exact. I was with my dad on a trip cross country. We stopped in Glacier National Park for a few days. We park at this local, super cool campground that has a lake nearby where I can go jump off the rocks and into the lake. My dad goes to the bar for a while. I was mature for my age, but looking back, it was still a bit weird. While I'm swimming and playing around the lake, this dude, a Native American guy, around 60, walks up to me. He tells me that there are certain things in this area that belong to the Blackfoot tribe. He tells me very thoroughly to not touch a single man-made object that I find in the middle of nowhere. Specifically says beads, necklaces, shoes, and drawings. My dumbass forgets about this, and later I will regret it. Later on that week, I was hiking with my dad, and we came across some beads that were sticking out of the ground a bit. I picked them up, and I go on with our hike. I got back to the campground. We went to bed. Now, that night, things turned bad. There was this wailing that could be heard from the campground. It did not sound human whatsoever, completely, almost ethereal. The kind of sounds to make the hair on your neck stand up. Now, me as a kid is quaking at this point. I'm shaking. I don't know what to do. And then, something walks up to the tent or motorhome, I don't quite remember, and it's breathing really heavily. It kind of sounds like a bear, but when you look out the window, there's nothing there. It's totally disembodied, even though you can hear it walking, you can hear it breathing. there's nothing there. I decide to try and go back to bed. But the next morning, when I wake up, we find out that a fisherman has been found dead around the lake that we were staying at. I have no idea how he died, but I vividly remembered the night before, and I couldn't help but put two and two together. Me and my dad, after this, drove to a town that was in not so good shape outside of this park. We were getting ready to head through the Midwest. We stopped at this Native American museum, the one in Browning, Montana. It was run by this really old woman. We explored a bit, and at some point, this bead randomly drops out of my pocket. This woman sees this and loses her mind. She tells me that I should never pick those up again. Me and my dad don't know what to make of this. We're both a little freaked out. He didn't even know I had it, so we just kind of walk out. By this point, we were thinking that the whole town was just full of weird people. When we walked out, it was so quiet. It was just like a bomb went off. We drive towards the Dakotas. Both of us are visibly weirded out. The same man from earlier is in the same diner as us when we stop. I notice him, and at some point between us ordering and getting our meal, he disappears. Now, there was no back door to this diner. He would have to walk by us in order for him to get out. I don't know if that's related. It's just something that was super weird and, as a kid, distressing to me. After everything he told me, I didn't listen and picked up the bead. But fast forward to that night, because the rest of the afternoon into the evening held nothing of note. I start having these weird dreams, like stuff that I couldn't comprehend, and some woman is yelling at me, telling me that there are more beads and that I've taken them, even though I don't have any more. I lost the one that I had. I wake up, and we're so far away from the park now, but there's those wailing sounds. They're back. This time, when I hear those terrible noises outside, the footsteps, the ragged breathing, I see this thing outside the camper staring at me. I can only describe it as demonic. Everything about it was wrong and just radiated evil. I closed the blind. I lay there sleepless from there on. Once we get out of Montana, the dreams stop. But fast forward to many years later, I go back to Montana with my uncle about a year ago. The exact same thing starts up again. Every night, the wailing, the sounds. I didn't see anything this time though, but still the same dreams about this woman yelling at me. I tried to go back to the museum to find the lady, but apparently she was dead. Now, I had no idea where the guy was that was at the park and that we saw in the diner, so I ended up finding someone else to ask about it. His eyes grew wide. He said he had to do a full ceremony to cleanse me. After he did the ceremony, the dream stopped, but he did advise me to not go picking up things in the woods. I'm surprised I haven't ever seen this mentioned online, but there are ruins in Montana that are really out of place. The area is, or was, guarded by the US military, or black trucks, claiming that the site is a missile site, but in reality, the locals all know what's there. I will talk about my experience here. It was the time that I went hiking, and we didn't encounter any government people. So, I was 14. I was living in Billings. My grandparents live in Yaak, Montana. One summer, during the second Bush administration, my parents sent me up there to spend a few weeks with my grandparents and cousins. The first few days were rough. It's rough going on my grandparents' farm, dealing with basically living off the grid. No Game Boy, no Xbox. My cousins were older than me and treated me fine, but the chores in the midsummer made me exhausted and stressed. One day, my cousins asked me if I wanted to go four-wheeling with them and my grandpa. I agreed, and we headed off in 2 trucks with the ATVs and the trailer and headed northwest. I forget how long we traveled, but we eventually arrived at the trailhead. My 3 cousins and my grandpa all had ATVs. I had to ride in back with my cousin Simon. Grandpa told us, assertively, to stay on the trails, as there were grizzlies in the area foraging. But they do tend to stay away from the trails because of the noise. So we set out, the 4 of us, with my grandpa at the lead. I remember how beautiful everything was, heading down the trails. After a few hours, we stopped at a small lake and had lunch. We were laughing and joking. In the distance, we could see Garver Mountain. Grandpa told us about the secret military base hidden in the mountain. As a kid, I thought of games like Halo, full of super soldiers that were fighting some kind of alien threat. My cousins were enamored by the idea. Grandpa warned them, though, of the black helicopters and vans that arrest people if they get too close. My cousins agreed to not head in that direction, but I knew they were lying. We packed up, and we set off to head back to the trucks. Again, Grandpa in the lead. About an hour into the drive, I realized that my cousins aren't following Grandpa. They're heading toward the mountain. I yelled to Simon, asking him if this was a good idea. He nodded his head and assured me that it would be fine and it'd be great. Eventually, we hit a fence with some warning signs telling us to stay out. We traveled in, maybe for about 20 more minutes through some very thick forest until we reached a break in the fence. The break was big enough to ride through. I remember the screech of the fencing against the sides of the four-wheeler. We traveled down valley for a bit as the river ran near the mountain. Eventually, we see columns next to trees, old ones that looked kind of Egyptian. We stopped and got on foot and started looking around. We realized that we had actually passed by a large ruined building. We started exploring the grounds. There are carvings of bird people everywhere. They were simple and looked like humans with bird heads and long legs. There were other carvings included. There was circles and triangles, odd patterns. My cousins were laughing about how awesome this is and how they all felt like Indiana Jones. We approached the main building, and it was massive but overgrown. There were old boxes everywhere, with army stuff stamped all on the outside, and rusted generators and equipment in the center. I was nervous. I wanted to leave. But my cousins continued on to the main building. There were more bird people carvings everywhere, and a massive stone pillar in the center. At that point, we hear it. A helicopter echoing through the valley. My cousins joke that it's the men in black and we should run. This freaked me out, and I started kind of actually crying as we ran back to the ATVs. We peeled out of the sight and headed back towards the hole in the fence. My cousins were laughing, while I was crying. But waiting for us at the hole were two big black SUVs, which I thought odd considering how thick the forest was. Overhead, I could hear helicopters. It sounded like more than one. The guys waiting had guns drawn. These were guns that I didn't recognize, so I couldn't tell you what they were. And they were wearing basically normal clothes. They arrested us and brought us to a ranger station where we stayed for a whole day in a small cabin that was attached to the building. My cousins were freaked out and asked for help, but every time they were told to shut the F up by the men outside the door. Eventually, my grandpa showed up and told us that we were all going home. No one spoke to us as we left. The ATVs were gone, and the other truck we drove was gone too. My grandpa said that they took them, and we were to never talk about this ever again. The entire drive home was quiet. We got to my grandparents, and my grandma was crying and hugged us. They told us to never talk about this to anyone, and if anyone asked us, we broke down in the woods, and Grandpa rescued us. We never talked about it with each other or my grandparents. It really scared the hell out of us, and I certainly never told my parents. About a year later, in school, I heard someone talking to another kid about the hidden temple in the Kootenai forest. I asked him about it, and he recounted a story about how his dad and grandpa found the same place while hunting one winter. The kid described things perfectly. Fearing the government people, I told him to just keep it to himself and not to talk about it. Even now, I'm a bit uneasy discussing this. I'm not sure if anyone else has been up there. I tried using, at the time, Google Earth, now Google Maps, and other providers to try and find it, but no luck. I'm not sure if the trees cover everything up or if the government's just editing things like that out. Similarly, searching online pulls up not a whole lot. I'll never forget those carvings and all the odd shapes carved into that ancient-looking rock. This doesn't have any off-the-charts action like some stories you might hear, but this is something that did make me reconsider living in remote areas. I went camping with two of my buddies about 7 years back. We were backpacking out in the mountainous woods of Montana. Every day we would wake up, hike until about noon, and then find a place to camp for the night and spend the rest of the daylight hours fishing or shooting cans with a BB gun. All of us had real firearms, but as you know, ammo isn't cheap, and we wanted them only for emergencies. We had a great first few days. On the fourth day, we must have been about 50 miles from the nearest road. We decided that that would be as far as we go, and tomorrow we would head back the way we came. We were pretty high up on a hill at this point, and we had a lovely view of the landscape. We found what seemed to be the concrete foundation of a long-since demolished fire watch station, and decided that it would be the perfect place to camp. We made a fire, and then we went to sleep. It was still pretty early, but we were all tired as hell. Later that night, I woke up to take a pee. I walked out to the edge of the concrete platform, and it was basically pitch black outside. The stars were beautiful though. I remember pointing my flashlight down the hill the way we came because I didn't want to point it at the tents and wake up my buddies. The flashlight was pretty weak, one of those gigantic heavy ones with a dark yellow light that barely lights up 30 feet in front of you. I could just barely make out what I thought was a deer moving across the path that we took up the hill, but it was too far for my flashlight to really hit it, and there were about a dozen trees in the way, so I only saw a few flashes of it. After a few seconds, I saw that it was actually not a deer, it was a person, and I started to freak out because I assumed that it was a ranger that was about to give us hell for lighting a fire without a permit. Every time I looked back, they were a couple feet closer to me, and I could hear them taking slow steps whenever I looked down in an attempt to control my stream. I didn't realize it at the time how strange it would be for a ranger to be out wandering without a flashlight at 2 in the morning, but I was tired. I could only still barely make out the rough shape of them in the darkness with my really crappy flashlight, but I finished up my business and then pointed the flashlight back at the person. They weren't moving toward us anymore, just standing there with their arms at their sides. I yelled out to them and asked if they needed something. I got no response. At this point, my buddies were awake, and they came out of their tents to see what was going on. One of them had a much more powerful flashlight than I did, and he pointed it over to where I was pointing mine. It illuminated the person, and we could see them pretty clearly now. They were tall, not inhumanly tall, but fairly lanky, and probably 6.5 feet tall. And something was indeed wrong with this person. They very clearly had sideways facial features. They weren't bloody or anything. It's not like they were attacked by a bear and it rearranged their face. Their eyes were just sideways, and the mouth was also sideways. They were staring directly at us and smiling pretty hard, although I don't know if I would actually consider it smiling, because it basically was just baring its teeth at us, maintaining eye contact. It was still pretty far away, probably 100 feet maybe, but we could still all see its face very clearly. Its eyes were wide open enough for us to see the whites. We were all pretty shocked, obviously. One of my buddies pulled out his gun. As soon as this thing saw the gun, it just sort of coughed, or gurgled. It sounded kind of like someone choking on a sneeze. It turned around, but kept looking at us over its shoulder as it moved back the way it came from. It wasn't making any sort of effort to stay hidden, and with the bright light from my buddy, we watched it walk off into the woods for about 10 minutes before we couldn't see it anymore. All of us were freaking out, and we immediately packed up our camp and lit the fire again. That was the scariest part, to be honest. Not seeing the thing first, but packing up the camp basically in the dark because we couldn't hold our flashlights and survey the woods while we were packing our bags or dismantling our tents. We heard plenty of noises, and the entire time we felt like this thing was going to sprint out of the darkness, but it never did. We had our rifles out until daylight, and then we hiked faster than I've ever hiked, and we got out of the woods. We hiked so fast that we were out by noon. We threw our stuff into the truck and drove 90 miles per hour, checking the mirrors every 10 seconds. We never saw that thing again. Once we were back in town, we all recounted exactly what we had all seen to each other, and our descriptions of the thing's face were all exactly the same. Wide eyes, sideways features, teeth bared. We were trying for hours to rationalize it, but none of us could really figure out why somebody would be out in the middle of the woods with no flashlight or backpack, stalking some random hikers in the middle of the night. None of us think that it was a human, but we've got no explanation either. It's basically a campfire story for us at this point, but all of us were entirely sober, and we all remember the exact same thing. It never attacked us. It wasn't bloody or snarling. The woods didn't fall silent. This thing didn't smell like rotting flesh. It was just strange, bizarre. It looked wrong. It moved wrong. And the scariest part was when we couldn't see it at all, because we didn't know if it was going to be right next to us. We still go camping from time to time, and I've had some other weird stuff happen too, but this is just about this particular one. But nowadays we stick to actual campsites, and we usually invite more friends than before. Solo backpacking is out of the question for me. I made this pretty bad sketch in MS Paint of what it looked like. Oddly enough, the nose looked totally fine from what we could see. Aside from the sideways face and it being really tall, it looked normal. The part that freaked us out was how it stared and how it moved. And we didn't need to fire any warning shots, although we were all thinking about doing it. As soon as it saw the gun, it started backing away. Maybe other people or other campers had fired at it before, and it understood what the gun was. That would mean it's quite intelligent. We kept our guns loaded and in our hands for the entire journey back. We never wanted to go looking for it during the day either. We were freaked the hell out and just wanted to leave. Getting back out there would be a big hassle, and we have no idea where it went. We watched it until we couldn't see it anymore, and then stood there for a bit to make sure it didn't come back before we started packing up. We all sort of understood that it wasn't just some guy, and that shooting it might not work. We didn't want to make it angry, I guess, and we certainly didn't want to stick around to see if it brought back any friends. We did check the area that it was standing in and where it walked out of the woods, because that was the path that we had to take to get back down the hill. There was nothing suspicious that we found. So, what'd you think of those? Let me know which one was your favorite one down in the comments. Also, let me know if you have any suggestions for specific areas that you'd like me to try to find something on. And if you have your own story, I have an email in the description below that you can send them to if you'd like to. And in the description as well is a link to a PayPal and a Patreon. That's how you can support me if you would like to. There's also super thanks, but remember, just watching the video, liking the video, and commenting are great too. And with that, I think I will thank you for pulling up a stump, and I'll thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.